Hey.
It's safe to say that the Memphis Grizzlies are one of the more unique teams that the NBA has seen in its recent history. They made the playoffs last season without having any real star players in their team and just having a whole lot of depth with just a bunch of really good role players and rotational guys, and overall they just play great team basketball. But I also call them unique because they currently have 21 players on their current payroll for next season, including their two-way players. But the crazier thing, if you ask me, is that I feel confident in saying that 14 of those 21 players are legit guys who could be rotational pieces on any team in the NBA. So one thing that will definitely be fun to watch for NBA fans over these next couple of months heading into the regular season is who gets cut, who gets traded, how exactly do the Memphis Grizzlies trim themselves down to the 15-player roster that's necessary for the season. And the main reason why they have so many players in their roster right now is because they've been a pretty active team in this offseason. Even though they haven't been making any huge moves, they've made a good amount of them. So let's talk about what they've done so far. First off, there was a 4-team trade around the time of draft day where the Grizzlies ended up sending away Jonas Valanciunas and they got Eric Bledsoe and Steven Adams in return. There were also a whole bunch of draft picks and other smaller players involved, but those are just minute details that don't really pertain to the Grizzlies. Now, I wasn't quite sure what to make of this trade at first because the Grizzlies were trading away the best player in Jonas Valanciunas and they were taking on 2 contracts that aren't necessarily team friendly. So I did do some research on it. It makes more sense to me now, especially with the fact that we have the hindsight that the Grizzlies were not done making moves after this trade. Now, the biggest reason why they got rid of Valanciunas was for financial purposes. Simply put, Valanciunas was due for a new contract this offseason which would have locked him down for the next at least 3 or 4 years. And when looking at the current roster of the Memphis Grizzlies, it's clear that they want Jaren Jackson Jr. to be the center of their future, but the problem is that he's not quite there yet with his build and size and just overall muscle, so they don't want to just throw him in there and have him perform poorly. They still want to have a center that can help manage the flow with him. So again, rather than lock down Valanciunas for a lot of years and give him money, they decided to trade him away and get Steven Adams in return, who can offer similar assets, but he only has 2 more years left on his contract, which should be enough time for Jaren Jackson Jr. to grow into that center role. And hopefully, assuming there's no more injuries with him, that should be the case. So in terms of the center position, the trade was all money related. As for Eric Bledsoe, the Grizzlies were not done with him yet. Because as we saw recently, he was then sent to the LA Clippers where they got Patrick Beverley, Rajon Rondo, and Daniel Oturu in return. And this was another trade that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me at first because again, the Grizzlies were getting rid of the best player involved in that offer for a bunch of point guard, veteran players, and Daniel Oturu, none of which have a real clear fit on this Memphis Grizzlies team. But much like Eric Bledsoe in the Valanciunas deal, a similar thing would happen with the players in this trade where they were going to be used in later moves later on. Not to mention, I also assume that Rajon Rondo will be a part of either a later move or just simply be waived at some point before the regular season. I very much doubt that he's on this roster come playing time. But in terms of later moves, Patrick Beverley was a couple days later then traded to the Minnesota Timberwolves where they got Jarrett Culver and Juancho Hernangomez in return. And finally, we have a trade that looks more suitable to the Memphis Grizzlies and what they've been doing over recent years. And I say that because rather than stick with the veteran and Patrick Beverley at a position where you don't really need any more point guards, they went out and they took a chance on 2 younger prospects who haven't necessarily been great so far in their careers, but again, the Grizzlies love their young guys, they love their projects, so they decided to take another stab at 2 of them. But this is actually where my main issue with this trade comes in, believe it or not. Because like I said, Culver and Hernangomez have not been too great to start their NBA careers, and compared to the other young players on this Memphis roster, they just simply haven't been as good. So while I love the fact that both of them are getting a new opportunity on a new team with a good development office, I just don't see how they're going to get the playing time necessary to prove themselves or just have anything that beneficial happen to them while in Memphis, like I said, just because there's so many other good young players playing in front of them. So overall, all of the trades that the Grizzlies have made this offseason have been for financial reasons. They've given away a whole bunch of talent in order to save money at certain positions. Even though that's not a good thing, it's something that we should have seen coming from a team that, again, is just filled with talent from end to end. Because even though they have dumped a bunch of good players this offseason, they still have so many other good players that I remain excited for as we approach the next season. For starters, obviously they have their cornerstone player in Ja Morant. And to be honest, I was much lower on Morant this past season than I would say the consensus was. I legitimately thought at times that Jonas Valanciunas was the Grizzlies' best player for stretches of games. But I will say, I was very impressed by Ja Morant when it came time to him performing in the postseason. He had the big game against the Warriors in the play-in game that would clinch the playoffs for Memphis, where he hit the big game winner in that game as well. Then he helped steal Game 1 in Utah once they did get to the playoffs, which he then followed up by a huge 47-point performance in Game 2. So even though the Grizzlies did get hit with the gentleman's sweep in that series, it was still very promising to see a 21-year-old Ja Morant finish his first playoff series in his career with a 38-5 stat line. I also remain very high on Jaren Jackson Jr. to be a good 1B to Ja Morant's 1A, obviously once he's back and healthy on the team, because he did miss most of last season due to injury. But if you do look at the year prior, as a 20-year-old, Jackson Jr. put up 17 and 5 per game, as well as he shot just a hair under 40% from 3 on over 6 attempts from 3 a game. So even though the jump shot's still a bit wacky, it's going in, and he was slowly proving that he is for real a offensive threat. At just a young age of 20 years old, he was already proven to be one of the more unique offensively minded big mans in the NBA. And I still don't hesitate at all to say that if Jaren Jackson Jr. had been healthy for the entirety of this past season, I very much think he would have been more than 20 point per game scorer, which again, in the NBA, 20 point per game scorers do not grow on trees. But I think he also would have been an above 40% shooter from 3, which by year 3, being a 21-year-old would have been great accomplishments for Jackson Jr. But as he's getting healthy now in current day, the most important things that he's going to have to develop from here on out is simply just growing his body, getting it ready for that center position, because as of now he's still a little bit of frail and skinny. But he's also going to have to work on his defense because he has the long, lanky body, he's mobile, he's someone who's already averaging over a block per game, which is a good sign, but there's definitely still ways to go. And if he's able to do that and then transition to the center job fully for this roster, then that's when the Memphis Grizzlies can officially focus on becoming a contender in this league. And I say that because in addition to Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr., they also have a bunch of really good young talent off the bench already as well. For starters, it's criminal how underrated DeAnthony Melton is in the league. His numbers might not seem too crazy, but he did have a breakout year of sorts in this last season. And I say that because he's still the same all-defensive level defender, but he added so much to his offensive game. Not only was he a 41% shooter from 3, but he showed a ton of flashes of being able to score off the dribble as well, which all of these things combined with his already great defense makes him an absolute perfect pair with Ja Morant in the backcourt. Because of this, I'm telling y'all, keep your eyes on DeAnthony Melton for this next season. And seeing this next player still hurts me to this day tremendously as a Celtics fan, because we had him at the 30th pick overall, but then we went out and traded him to the Grizzlies, and of course I'm talking about Desmond Bane. To put it simply, he's just another player on this Memphis roster that has an extremely high IQ and plays great defense, plus Bane just shoots the hell out of the ball. 43% three-point shooters who can also hold their own on the defensive end are not cheap by any means in this league. Yeah, the Grizzlies went out and got one at the 30th overall pick, and I remain very jealous of them for that. And the last specific guy that I'm going to mention briefly, because if I didn't, I'd just be here all day talking about the endless talent on this Grizzlies roster, but I'm going to finish this by talking about Xavier Tillman. Which, I'll be honest, at the time of last year's draft, I had no idea who Xavier Tillman was, but draft Twitter was up in arms about him being a second round pick when he should have been drafted higher. And now that we're a year or so into his career, I can understand why at this point. That's because Xavier Tillman is just so unique for a big man. Throughout his rookie season, he showed a ton of flashes as a rim protector on defense and a passer from the big man spot on offense, and he was even able to get a good amount of playing time at the end of the season due to a bunch of injuries. Then I saw him playing in this year's summer league and was just absolutely blown away by some of the plays he was making. He was full on grabbing rebounds and just taking off on the fast break like he was some sort of Nikola Jokic. He even had this really awkward yet smooth looking play where he hit a step back of sorts 3 off the dribble and absolutely just cashed it. Easy to say, Tillman is another player on this Grizzlies roster that you're going to want to keep your eye on just because he's going to continue to show these weird but awesome flashes from the big man position, and he could end up being very useful. Although he probably won't see a whole lot of minutes at first because there is a whole lot of talent in front of him at the big man spot on this roster, but we're hoping for the best. All in all, I'm not entirely sure that this Grizzlies roster got a whole lot better in this offseason. Because they lost Valanciunas, they didn't add anyone else substantial except for Steven Adams, which even in itself, that's not really that big of a pickup. But you could also make the point that all of the young players on this team are going to continue to grow and approach their peaks as they get older and more developed, which will in turn make their roster better overall. But one thing that is for sure is that this Grizzlies front office, they're making sure to take their time and to build this roster well, rather than go after high value free agents and just throw them onto this team and see what happens. And I can appreciate that. But at the same time, if you're a fan of the team, you have to understand that because they're doing it that way, the win totals from year to year aren't going to see a whole lot of improvement, if any at all. Which is mostly what the case will be this year as well, because even though the West is looking a bit more open than usual because of some injuries to the top teams, I still don't expect this Grizzlies team to make a whole lot of noise. I really don't see them being any higher than a play-in team, but again, if you're a Grizzlies fan, that's not a bad thing per se. You might not be winning a whole lot now, but you still have a bright future ahead of you. You have two cornerstone pieces in Morant and Jackson Jr. So I'm telling you, enjoy the good moments now while they're young and have little to no expectations, because pretty soon the championship window is going to open for these guys, and by that point every game is just going to make you have this love-hate relationship where you want to see them win so bad that it just hurts when they lose, and having a contending team is fun but it sucks at the same time, so enjoy what you have now. And if you've made it to this point in the video, then congratulations, you're a real one. Now if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about hitting the subscribe button, should be somewhere in this general direction. Or if you're not sure yet, maybe check out another video which should be in this general direction. Either way, thank you for watching.